It's Chapter 3 of The Whistling Mountain by Mary Dane. The cabin was by itself, higher up than the other buildings, and it looked as if it had grown there all by itself instead of having been built by men. The logs were brown and the roof was red, and there was a porch across the front with a fancy railing. A long set of steps led from the trail up to the porch, and there was a flag waving gaily from the tall flagpole in the neatest of yards. David wanted to run right up the steps, but first he had to ask his father something. "What's this big fenced-in place and those buildings there? Are they part of our home?" "Well, they are part of Swiftwater Warden's station. That big fenced-in yard is the corral where we keep the horses. They aren't here yet, but they will be coming any day now. That's the barn there where we put the saddle horses and where the hay is kept, and the saddles and pack boards and other things we need for the horses. And that building is the storage shed where everything we need for trail clearing and firefighting and such is kept. The trail gang sleep and eat there too, but they aren't here yet either. All the stores have to be checked once a month. That's something you can help me with if you will." David felt very big and important and proud. Already his father needed him. Perhaps he wasn't going to be quite so lonely after all. And wouldn't all the kids in his old school envy him if they knew he was going to be really doing a man's work? "Let's take Mother up those steps and show her our new home." David stopped daydreaming. Oh, those steps, there were so many of them. And how his feet hurt. His mother hadn't said much, but he was pretty sure her feet hurt too. Usually he could tell when his mother was tired. She just stopped talking. He'd been so busy thinking about himself that he'd forgotten other people could be tired too. "I'll take that suitcase if you want to go ahead, Mother." "Why, thanks, David. I don't know what I'd do without you." David felt bigger than ever as he lugged their belongings up all 27 steps, counting them as he went. Inside, the house smelled wonderful. It smelled deliciously of stew and of wood smoke, and of a big pot of cocoa which simmered at the back of the stove. The wide floorboards were scrubbed clean and the windows shone. David's mother sank gratefully into the nearest chair, but David suddenly had enough pep to poke into all of the rooms. He stopped in front of the kitchen stove, which still gave off a bit of heat. "Hey, how do you work this kind of a stove?" "With wood, son, and it certainly is work. No buttons to press or knobs to turn. I filled it up before I went down to meet my family, but it needs attention again. Now watch." He carefully lifted off a stove lid and placed some sticks of kindling on top of the still smoldering remains of the morning fire, put back the stove lid, opened up the side draft, and waited. They heard a crackling sound, a snap, and a dull roaring. Mr. Dunn lifted the lid again and gently placed heavier wood on top of the flaming kindling. The crackling increased, and he replaced the lid and let the fire draw a bit before he shut off the drafts. "We'll have a good meal here in a few minutes now. We've got to look after that mother of yours, you and I. Just as soon as you get those wet shoes off, you can help me here." David looked down at his feet and smiled ruefully. Oh golly, were his shoes in a mess. They were soggy and covered with mud, and he had left little dabs of it everywhere he had stepped. "Oh, gee, I'm sorry," he apologized. "Where will I find dry socks, Mom?" "In the bag you're still holding in your hand," she laughed. "Better take it into your bedroom." "Which room is mine, Dad?" "That one there. It's not very big, but wait until you see the view." David opened the door and stopped. He stood stock still. The room was no bigger than the one he had had in the apartment. The bed was just as plain, and the same rug his grandmother had hooked for him was on the floor. In the apartment he had had a window, to be sure, but it had looked out onto a narrow yard where the cars of various tenants were parked. On the other side of the yard was another apartment building, tall and plain. But this room had a window all the way across it. He could look out and see a million trees. But even better than that, there was a mountain. And such a mountain. It was taller than any building he could remember back in the city. It was so tall that the trees stopped growing on it about halfway to the top. And right then there was a cloud wound around the upper slopes like a hat or a lady's scarf. David could scarcely breathe with the wonder of it. He had a mountain. A mountain to look at every day, a mountain all to himself. Oh, Mother, come and look at this. His voice squeaked with excitement. Is it very far from here, Dad? No, as a matter of fact, it isn't. There's only a narrow valley between Swiftwater Mountain, which we are actually living on, and Mount Carmichael, which you can see from your window. Most of the people who live in this district don't call it Carmichael, though. They call it Marmot Mountain. Why, Dad? Well, you ought to be able to guess that, because there are so many marmots on it. Mrs. Dunn stood at the window in silence, and then she too exclaimed at the view. Oh, Bill, I didn't dream we'd be this far up the mountain. Look at all that climbing we did to get here. Mercy, I don't think I'll ever have the courage to go down into the town again. But we can stand here looking another time. I'm hungry, and you two were going to feed me, remember? David ate as if he had not had a meal for a week. He polished off 2 plates of stew, and he drank 2 cups of cocoa, and then he finished with bread and butter. Who else lives over there on my mountain? He continued his questioning. What else besides marmots? Oh, ever so many things. Squirrels, like those you saw today, and weasels and martens and black bears on the lower slopes, and big grizzly bears higher up. And once in a while there are deer and, porcupines and chipmunks and pack rats and mountain sheep and even mountain goats. But the marmots stay up where the rocks are big and loose so they can hide underneath them when danger comes. The grizzly bears love to eat them, but they don't get many. The marmots have a built-in warning system. How big is a marmot, Dad? Oh, about as big as a large, fat cat, although some are bigger. They're just the same shade as the rocks, and they sit up and look about like prairie dogs or gophers. They have short, strong legs and bushy, heavy tails. And the minute they sense danger, like a dark cloud going over, or a rock rolling, or a flicker of movement, they set their warning system to work with a whistle that can be heard miles away. Then every marmot within hearing vanishes down the nearest crack or cranny. You get a few of those fellows all sounding their warning systems at the same time, and you can really hear them. Do you think I could sometime soon? Could what? Oh, could hear them whistle. David kicked his foot against the table in embarrassment. And I've just got to learn to whistle like the other kids. Why can't I anyway? Probably because you try too hard. Now why don't you go out on the porch and sit for a while? If you listen really hard and the wind is right, you might hear the marmots. Oh, and before I forget, no wandering. But stick to the house for today, son, until I have time to show you around. I don't want you to forget that this is real wilderness. Don't go away from the house until I say you may, and tell you where. Stick to the house, as though you were 5 years old instead of 9. David turned to his mother, but if he thought she was going to take his part, he was mistaken. You'll have to do what your father tells you. This isn't Vancouver, David. David moved out onto the porch. He felt choked with resentment. He hated being treated like a baby. Who wanted to stay in the house when there was the whole outdoors to explore? He sat on the top step and angrily pushed the fair hair from his eyes. Even the sight of the mountains straight across from him didn't make him smile, nor the whiskey-jack bird that saucily flew over. The scarf of cloud moved from the mountain, and the sun poured down into the valley and lit up the leaves of all the trees. A gentle wind began to tease the tips of the branches, and high up in the heavens, an eagle soared. David watched it as the speck came nearer, and he wished with all his heart that he could be a bird and fly away up there in the sky. He tried to imagine what it would be like to be even higher than the mountain tops. His thoughts were far away with the big bird, when suddenly he heard it, a clear, shrill whistle of alarm, then another and another, as the eagle swooped towards its quarry. The marmots, I've heard them, my very first day here. Why, I know what I'll call my mountain. I'll call it Whistling Mountain. And soon, really soon, I'm going to be whistling, just like those old marmots. See if I don't. David made himself a promise. That's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4. Early the next morning, David, having dropped off to sleep after an early supper, woke slowly. He was in a strange bed, and he didn't know where he was. He rubbed his eyes and sat up straight and listened. No cars starting up in the parking place and no planes roaring overhead. The garbage collector wasn't clanking cans, nor was the milkman rattling bottles. It was decidedly strange. "Are you awake in there?" That was his father's voice, big and deep. "Hungry?" His mother's voice was sweet and musical. "I'm just waking up," he called back. "And say, where am I anyway?" He opened his eyes wider, and then he woke up completely. Look at my mountain," he shouted. "It's on fire." Mr. Dunn was out of bed in a single bound. He fairly raced to David's window. Fire was a warden's worst enemy. He turned, and he didn't know whether to laugh or to scold. "That's just the sunshine hitting the top of the mountain," he explained. "There's a little patch of snow up there which catches the sun's rays and reflects them. And that's what makes it look as though the mountaintop were burning. No wonder you made that mistake." David felt very foolish. He ought to have known, but there seemed to be so much to learn all at once. He snuggled down under the warm blankets again. "No need for you to get up just yet. I'll start the fire and warm the place up a bit. I guess we haven't got a thermostat?" "No, we certainly haven't. It gets mighty chilly here at night. You'll be filling the wood box up a good many times a day." He crossed the bare floorboards, and David listened hard. The stove lid clanged. A cupboard door opened, and dishes rattled, and his father began to whistle. David put his lips together and tried and failed again. He yanked the blankets up higher and stared out of the window at the shining mountaintop. He wondered if the marmots were awake. He wondered how long it would be before he could see one. "Dad," he called, "is it very much of a climb to the top of my mountain?" Mr. Dunn put another stick of wood on the fire. "It certainly is," he replied. "Could I climb it this summer, do you think?" "I don't have to think about that one. The answer is no. You're not nearly old enough to climb that mountain. And besides, you don't just start out by climbing the biggest mountain you can find. Don't be silly, David." "I am old enough to climb that mountain," David grumbled to himself, but he didn't say it out loud. "Dad's been away so long he's forgotten just how old I am. I bet I could start out this morning and get right to the top." He kicked the blankets aside and jumped out of bed onto the rug. It felt good under his bare feet. David stood there stretching. He was thin, but he was growing fast, and he couldn't quite catch up to himself. Suddenly he realized that he was very, very hungry, even hungrier than usual. He dressed quickly and hurried out to the kitchen. The kitchen was a cheerful room. The wood in the stove crackled and popped, and warm waves of heat came from the open oven door. A kettle with a bright red handle was throwing off steam at a great rate as it boiled the water for his mother's morning cup of tea. His father had set a wire rack on top of the stove and had covered it with slices of bread. When they were golden brown, he turned them over, then buttered them and placed them on a plate in the oven to keep hot. That smells good. May I have a piece?" He reached into the oven for a piece of toast and began to munch. "Take your mother her tea while I set the table, and put the oatmeal into the bowls. We eat a good breakfast here. I get hungry working out of doors, and so will you." David was sure he couldn't eat oatmeal porridge. That was for little boys. But David's dish was polished clean when he had finished. After breakfast, there were the trunks to open, the trunks which had been brought up the steep trail by half a dozen friendly men from the town below, using good strong muscles and a hand-drawn wagon. There had not been time to empty them the night before. Out from them came tablecloths, handkerchiefs, clothing, books, and bedroom slippers. David's mother kept him busy, helping to put them away. David took his own clothes into his room, and every time he went in, he stopped and gazed out of his window at his whistling mountain. When all of his clothes were on hangers or placed more or less neatly in a small chest of drawers, David rebelled. "Can't I go outside now?" he asked as he stumbled over a pile of pillowcases. "Yes, I suppose so. Be sure and put on your red sweater, and your old shoes are in that box over there. Stay right close to the house and don't wander off by yourself. You might get lost." "Oh, Mother," David exclaimed disgustedly. "Do I have to wear a sweater? Nobody in this family wears a sweater in the summertime, and gosh, I won't get lost. Nobody in this family is living in Vancouver anymore. And this is the middle of a forest, remember? You can get lost 10 feet from our front door. Your father says so." David pulled the red sweater over his head, but his face was like a thundercloud. He was just about to say something when his father let out a sharp shh. Come into the kitchen quickly and don't make a sound. Now look out of the window. Oh, my heavens. David's mother grabbed at his father's arm. Get your gun and shoot it, Bill. David, go back into your room. David was too excited to move. He stood on tiptoe and stared. We aren't allowed to shoot the animals in a national park, remember? Mr. Dunn smiled. That's just a black bear cub looking for something to eat in our garbage can. I'm afraid I forgot and threw out some stale bread yesterday, and he must have smelled it. If we are careful never to throw out food, but burn our scraps instead, we won't have any trouble with bears. Watch how easily this one runs. Don't open that door, Bill, please. Tap on the window, son. The little bear was off in a flash, looking comical as he humped himself along. You won't be back in a hurry, Mr. Dunn chuckled. I'm going out now. I've got my sweater on. David looked inquiringly at his mother. You stay right around the house now, mind me. Oh, Bill, Bear's right in our backyard. David will be all right if he stays close to the house, as we have told him, Mr. Dunn said quietly. That little bear is still running, and he was only a cub, but we don't want to forget that there are bigger ones in the woods. And that is one of the reasons why I want you to stay right close for a day or two, David. David's eyes were still shining with excitement. He was sorry that his mother had been so frightened, but he wasn't, not one bit. Living on a mountain was going to be lots of fun. That's the end of chapter 4.